The second case study we're going to look at is something called the Northern Cities Shift. So this is a linguistic change that is ongoing in the northern United States. So some examples of this are pronouncing the word and as something like "and" and can as something like "can." And there are other changes. This is just one part of it. Um, so this change originated in New York, but not really in New York City, but the upstate, so places like Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo. And then it's gradually been spreading westward to other major northern cities in the United States, so to Detroit and Chicago. And then gradually it's been spreading in between these major cities to the smaller cities in between. So in terms of how this is spread, it's kind of like uvular R in Europe, right? It didn't start in New York and then just spread gradually through across the map, right? It jumped to other cities, which is why it got named the Northern Cities Shift because it was originally evident only in cities, right? Like Chicago, Detroit. Of course, since then it's spread out, and it's not only people in the cities who've adopted this change. So Northern Cities Shift is interesting not only because of how it spread, but also because how it hasn't spread, right? So those northern United States cities, well, they're awfully close to some Canadian cities. So think about Detroit. Detroit is one of the major focal areas of the Northern Cities Shift. Um, and Detroit is right on the border with Canada, right? So Windsor is a city in Ontario, and it's just across the river, actually south of Detroit, right? It's the only major Canadian city that looks north to an American city. So if you're just thinking of geography, right, and this northern city shift is jumping from city to city, so it's spread to Detroit. If it could make it from Detroit to Chicago, you might think it could easily spread from Detroit to Windsor as well. But it hasn't, not in the slightest. So people in Windsor, nobody in Windsor would be caught dead pronouncing and as and, okay? Just not going to happen. So, well, why not? Why did it not make that very, very short jump, right? Of course, there's a river there, but that doesn't really matter much these days, and they have tunnels there anyway. So, no, it's not. It's not because of any physical boundary. It's a matter of identity in this case, in particular, national identity, right? So, um, there's that border, right? People in Windsor are Canadians, and people in Detroit are Americans for the most part, and the American speakers who've adopted the Northern City Shift, right, the people in Rochester and Detroit and Chicago, it's not really regarded as a marker of identity. It's an example of a change. For those people, it's an example of a change from below. It just happened and they didn't even really realize it was happening. But for outsiders, such as the Canadians across the border, who hear these Americans saying things like and or can, well, that starts to sound really, really American to us, right? So for a Canadian, that sounds like a strong marker of being an American, um, which is enough for a Canadian not to adopt it, right? So that's prevented it from making that very short jump from Detroit to Windsor, right? It's really the border, not as a physical barrier, but as a kind of mental barrier, people's identity. So Jack Chambers, who's a sociolinguist at the University of Toronto, has done some interesting work on this kind of stuff. So he's looked at the role of the Canada-U.S. border on language changes, and he's shown that it can vary. So as he's described it, for some changes the border is like a brick wall and nothing gets across, whereas for other changes it's more like a screen door and the change passes through easily. Um, so for the Northern City shift, the Canadian-U.S. border is a brick wall because Canadians perceive that shift as being something very, very American, and therefore it's something that we don't want to adopt. But for another change, the fronting of oo, so this is pronouncing a word like you, not with a really back vowel like you, but with a more front vowel like you. Right? Um, this is something that doesn't have any national associations. As far as we can tell, it's happening in US English and in Canadian English, and the border is not making a difference. So Chambers has done some interesting work in the Golden Horseshoe area, which is the area from Toronto and then west around to Hamilton and then back around. So the end of Lake Ontario there, around to Niagara. And that blue line on the map, that's the border, right? That's the border between U.S. and Canada. So what he found, so if you look at some cities along here, so Toronto, then Hamilton, getting closer and closer to the US, then St. Catharines, then Niagara Falls, Ontario, which is right on the border. So what he found is that for certain variables, The closer you get to the US border, you might think people would sound more and more American, but actually, the closer you get to the border, the more Canadian people sound, right? The greater the proportion of Canadian variants that they use. Okay. So someone in Niagara Falls, Ontario, actually sounds statistically even more Canadian than someone in Hamilton. And then, so he describes this as the bastion mentality. And it's like the closer you get to the border, the more aware you are that you're really, really close to America. And then the more you want to make it clear that you're Canadian, you're not American, right? So it's that, you're like the last frontier. So people end up actually sounding more Canadian. And it works in reverse as well. So on the other side, right, people in Niagara Falls, New York, end up sounding statistically even more American than people do in Buffalo farther away, right? So for them, they know they're really close to Canada, so they want to make it clear that they're not Canadian, so they sound even more American. This is all subconscious, of course. No one is consciously doing this, but these are the numbers, right? This is what Chambers found. The Northern City shift is one of two major change shifts. And a change shift is a shift in which a bunch of sounds change their pronunciation at the same time. So there's two different change shifts that are happening right now in North America, and they're affecting some of the same vowels, but they're actually moving them in opposite directions in some cases, which makes confusion sometimes for speakers. So one of these is a Northern City shift, which, as I said, is places like Rochester, Syracuse, and so on. The other major change shift is something called the Canadian shift. And this has affected younger speakers in all the large English-speaking cities of Canada. It's also occurring in California, where it's known as the California shift, but it really is the same change, either way, Canadian shift or California shift. So first, the Northern Cities shift. So here are some examples, some recordings from a speaker who has a very advanced version of the Northern Cities shift. So what I'm going to do is first play just the word on its own that has an example of the shift. And you think about what word you think you're hearing. Okay? And then I'll play that word in context, in a phrase and in a longer sentence. And then it'll become clearer what the word actually is, and it may not have been what you thought it was. So number one.
Black, black, black.
Sounds something like black, maybe. Then hear it
Living on one black.
in a phrase.
Living on one black. Old senior citizens living on one black.
So it's actually the word block, right? Although it doesn't sound like Canadian pronunciation of block. And now
Sacks, sacks, sacks.
Probably sounds like sax or sex.
We're sacks. We're sacks. Yeah, we're sacks. Yeah, we're sacks.
So this is actually socks, right? Like as in stockings, footwear. Right? So the vowel there sounds quite different from the way Canadians pronounce it.
Desk, desk, desk.
Right? So you might hear that as desk or dask.
Right, right. Sorry.
Sitting behind the desk. So it's actually the word desk. This one might not have been as confusing because, in fact, this is a place where the Northern City shift and the Canadian shift have kind of converged, and they both, so it sounds similar to both of us, both areas.
Bosses,
Number four,
bosses,
that sounds like bosses.
the bosses with the intent. The bosses with the intent.
So she's actually talking about buses here, right? Like transit buses, but it sounds like bosses with the Northern City shift. And then number five,
Had, had, had.
okay, what that actually is,
Shook her head.
shook her head. So it's actually head, right? As standard pronunciation, head, but pronounced as had in the Northern City shift. So what's going on? Here's the English vowel chart. The Northern City shift. Well, these are the four major changes. The vowel a has been raised and tensed to sound like eh, so in words like and, cat, that. The vowel ah has been fronted to something more like ah or ah in words like block or socks or Chicago, which are pronounced with a shift like black, sax, and Chicago. The vowel eh has been backed and lowered to something more like a, so as in dask and had. And then the vowel has been back to something more like aw, as in what we would pronounce as buses being pronounced as bosses.